Hey everyone, this is your host with MindSpark, Science Now. It is a common observation that on a clear day, the sky is blue. But why is it that way? It turned out the answer was more complicated than we expected. It requires a combination of atmospheric physics and human perception. And we're going to start with the physics part because while we know intuitively that light travels in waves, it's actually an electromagnetic wave, meaning it has both electric and magnetic components. And different colors of light have different wavelengths. Red light has the longest wavelength in the visible spectrum, and violet light has the shortest. This is important because when light hits an object, if its wavelength is shorter than the size of the object, then it will get scattered in random directions. And the smaller the wavelength relative to the size of the object, the more easily it gets scattered. Okay, so now let's imagine what happens when sunlight enters Earth's atmosphere. Sunlight is really just a whole bunch of light waves with all different wavelengths, which is why we see it as white light. When those waves hit our eyes, our brains interpret them as having different colors. Anyway, as sunlight enters the atmosphere, it starts bouncing off all of the gas molecules and tiny particles suspended in the air. The rays of light are scattered in all directions. Crucially, blue light, which has a shorter wavelength than red light, gets scattered much more strongly by these particles. That means that any given ray of blue light is much more likely to be bounced out of its original path and into our eyes than a ray of red light. So because blue light is more easily scattered, we end up seeing a sky that's filled with scattered blue light. But wait a minute, that doesn't explain why we see the sky as blue. We see the sky as blue because our eyes are evolved to be most sensitive to blue light. If our eyes worked the same way as a camera, we could take a picture of the sky, and it would look gray, since all wavelengths of light would be equally represented. But we don't see the sky as gray. Our eyes contain photoreceptor cells called cones, which come in 3 types, each with a pigment that responds to either red, green, or blue light. When light hits a cone, it sends a signal to the brain telling us what color that light is. And while all 3 types of cones are stimulated by white light, each is only minimally stimulated by the color for which it's not optimized. So if our eyes were only capable of detecting blue light, we'd see the sky as blue. But we can also detect green and red light. And so while there's a lot more blue light bouncing around in the sky than red light, we perceive the sky as blue because our eyes are attuned to blue. But that still leaves an unanswered question. Why does blue light get scattered more easily than red light? Well, when light bounces off of something, the details of that interaction depend on the size of the light wave relative to the size of the object it's bouncing off of. If the light wave is much bigger than the object, like if radio waves hit a person, then the light gets scattered in a very predictable way that depends on the object's shape. But if the light wave is much smaller than the object, like if a baseball is hit by a baseball-sized ball, then the light gets scattered randomly with equal probability in every direction. In this case, the details of the light's interaction with the object don't matter. All that matters is the size of the light wave relative to the size of the object. This brings us to Rayleigh scattering, which describes how light gets scattered when the light wave is much smaller than the object it's bouncing off of. And here's where things get a little weird. According to Rayleigh scattering, the amount of scattering is inversely proportional to the 4th power of the wavelength. In other words, blue light, which has a shorter wavelength, gets scattered 100 times more strongly than red light. That's why the sky is blue. But there's another type of scattering called scattering, which describes how light gets scattered when the light wave is comparable in size to the objects it's bouncing off of. If light is much bigger than the particle it's hitting, like if a basketball is hit by a golf ball, the light gets scattered in a predictable way depending on the size and shape of the particle. Scattering causes large particles like water droplets to scatter all colors of light equally, which is why clouds look white. And it turns out that when sunlight hits large particles in the atmosphere, like water droplets or dust, those particles cause the sky to turn orange or even red during sunrise and sunset. That's because as the sun gets lower in the sky, its light has to pass through more atmosphere to reach our eyes. And as it passes through more atmosphere, more blue light gets scattered away, leaving mostly orange and red light. So while Rayleigh scattering dominates in the atmosphere, causing the sky to look blue during the day, me scattering can dominate at sunrise and sunset, causing the sky to look red. But wait, there's still another phenomenon that affects what colors we see in the sky: atmospheric absorption. As sunlight passes through the atmosphere, some parts of the electromagnetic spectrum, including ultraviolet and infrared, get absorbed by gas molecules, which is why we can't see those colors during the day. And when certain gases absorb certain wavelengths of light, they can actually remove entire bands of colors from the sky. For example, in the 19th century, scientists noticed that during volcanic eruptions, the sky would often turn green. They later figured out that this was due to the presence of a gas called sulfur dioxide, which would absorb red light and reflect green. So the color of the sky isn't just determined by how light gets scattered in the atmosphere. It's also affected by how much of that light gets absorbed by the molecules in the atmosphere. So while the sky should be black, not blue, according to our intuition, it's actually blue because our eyes are attuned to blue light. And it's red at sunrise and sunset, because the longer wavelengths of light pass through the more atmosphere and get scattered more by larger particles in the air. And sometimes it's even green, because certain gases absorb certain wavelengths of light. In fact, one time, scientists were able to use the changing colors of the sky to study the composition of the atmosphere. In the 1940s, a team of physicists, led by Nobel laureate Charles Hard Townes, built the first maser, a device that uses microwaves to amplify electromagnetic waves. A year later, another group of physicists used a maser to detect a previously unknown form of radiation in the atmosphere. They did this by pointing a maser at a tall tower and sending out a beam of radiation that got bounced back by the ionized gases in the atmosphere. Scientists had already predicted that the atmosphere should contain these ions, but no one had ever detected them before. And the researchers were able to identify their presence by the specific frequency of the bounced radiation. In other words, they were able to use the changing colors of the sky to study the composition of the atmosphere. And this isn't the only time that scientists have used the sky to learn about Earth. For centuries, sailors used the color of the sky to predict storms, since dark, brooding skies meant foul weather was on the way. And meteorologists today still use satellites to monitor the color of the sky to track weather patterns. But these are just a few examples of the many ways that the sky influences life on Earth. We are incredibly lucky to live on a planet with an atmosphere that is dynamic and responsive and full of color. And if you want to learn more about atmospheres in general, we've got a great episode about the weird atmospheres of other planets in the solar system. You might think that you already know what an atmosphere is, but you'll be surprised at just how diverse they are. And it's all brought to you with the help of our patrons. And you can help us make more videos like this one. Head over to our support page to learn more.